recognizes the gentlelady from Santa Fe, New Mexico, Congresswoman Leger Fernandez. I
Thank
looked it up,
you.
Teresa. I looked it up.
It is. And Santa
Welcome.
Fe, New Mexico is beautiful right now, and we don't have any we don't have any team in the race, so I'm staying out of all of that. But I am thankful to you for bringing to this committee the voting rights experts today to talk about the impact of both those 361 bills and existing barriers. You know, I think that increasing voter participation should be the goal of every lawmaker, whether that be Republican or Democrat, because it's the core of our democracy. And I was real pleased to know that 4 million more Latino voters cast a ballot in 2020 than in 2016. Native Americans defied the devastation of COVID, here in New Mexico and throughout the Southwest to vote in higher numbers. Ms. Diaz, you noted that Latino voters are younger than the average, and the 30.9% increase represents many first-time voters. What happens when a first-time voter faces voting barriers like long wait times? Does it impact that voter's likelihood of becoming a lifelong voter?
Absolutely. Voter suppression is a feedback loop, especially for youthful and growing diverse electorates who are already left out of the franchise because there's not a lot of data on them on the voter file. So they're not going to get all the information that likely voters already expect. So if a first-time voter is trying to cast a ballot and faces barriers, whether those are long lines, trying to figure out where to vote because the polling location has closed, trying to produce the ID because the state they live in doesn't take their student ID, then they're not going to cast a ballot. And they're going to remain in this spectrum and universe of voters who have not casted a ballot and are not going to get that information. It's until they cast that first ballot that they're going to be in the universe that receives all of the messaging and mobilization that makes our democracy great. So this is really a clear and present danger as we think about Asian American voters and Latino voters who are very young.
Thank you. And you listed some of the different barriers that apply. Why can't we accept these barriers or these measures as simply good governance measures that would apply equally to all?
Well, let me bring up the case of Miss Brenda Lee Garcia, who was a 44-year-old resident of Bexar County, Texas, and a longtime voter. Under Texas's vote by mail law, she had to be over the age of 65. Yet, Miss Lee Garcia was a registered working nurse during a global pandemic, helping us save American lives. And Texas law made it so that Miss Garcia was not eligible for a mail ballot. So I don't know what legitimate governmental interests would be to really force somebody who is there in our hospitals during a global pandemic when people are dying unnecessarily, that they in fact have to really balance saving lives, staying healthy, and their fundamental right to vote.
Thank you. Ms. Riggs or Mr. Adigbule, I've also litigated Section 2 redistricting cases, and as you know, they're intense and they're time consuming. So you noted that Section 2 alone won't protect the vote, partially because of the long time frame it takes to conclude a case. Can either of you speak to what you believe must be done to restore the efficacy of the Voting Rights Act?
I think, thank you, Representative, and I'll be brief so Mr. Adigbule has time to respond as well. We need a dynamic Voting Rights Act, Section 5, that addresses the current issues that we have in places where there are recent instances and examples of discriminatory acts. Those are the actors that a renewed Voting Rights Act needs to be addressed at. There are also practices that we know disproportionately harm voters of color, and without a pre-clearance mechanism, we can bring as many Section 2 cases as we want, but the wheels of justice turn slowly, and elections will proceed under illegal, unconstitutional plans before we can get relief, even preliminary injunction relief. So those known practices include adding at-large seats in heavily minority areas, certain voter purges, redistricting where there are significant voters of color. We need the Voting Rights Act to be able to do our work, to use Section 2 appropriately and obtain relief timely.
Mr. Adibi, we're sort of out of time, but if you could do a really quick summary.
Sure. The new legislation should focus on the current needs. That was one of the concerns that the Supreme Court had. History can inform those needs. That is to say, where you have continuing patterns, and there have been lots of patterns of persistent and adaptive discrimination. History is relevant, but it has to be any geographic remedy you would have for a pre-implementation, pre-clearance type regime that has the advantage of blocking and deterring discrimination before it can be visited on the victims is really important. The other things I would say is that the burden shift was a very important tool as well, and that's important to have.
I yield back. Thank you.
The gentlelady yields back, and I thank you for your questions. At this time, the chair recognizes the ranking member of the full committee,